Hey everyone, tonight I would like to travel with you to the limits of history and legend. I'm going to tell you about the myth of Atlantis. So please try to make yourself comfortable, wear your headsets, and I'll do the rest. Before I start, I wished to let you know that you can vote for one of the next topics you would like me to talk about. You will find a list of subjects at the bottom in the description, and you have until the 31st of May to vote. So thank you in advance for participating in this poll, and I will record the subject with the most votes at the beginning of June. Okay, let's go with our story now. Most people have heard that Atlantis would have been a very ancient island or even a continent with a brilliant civilization, and that it would have disappeared almost overnight in a cataclysm. But what is behind this story? How true is it? What does the success and ongoing popularity of this myth tell us? These are some of the topics I would like to tell you about today. And to start with our story, we need to go back to the antiquity, to Greece in the 4th century before Christ, because this is when the most ancient traces of this myth appear. And they are to be found in the works of Plato, the Greek philosopher. The form under which we know the thought, the writings of Plato, is dialogues. He wrote dialogues between various characters in which he exposed his reasoning, his understanding and opinions. And in 2 of these dialogues, written at the beginning of the 4th century before Christ in Athens, he mentioned the existence of an extremely ancient island called Atlantis, which he located west of Greece and quite far from Greece actually, because it would have been in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond what the Greeks called the Pillars of Hercules. The Pillars of Hercules are the name they gave to the mountains north and south of the Strait of Gibraltar that marks the separation between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea, between Spain and Morocco today. And he said that the island or the kingdom of Atlantis would have been a large and very powerful kingdom west of these Pillars of Hercules, where a king named Atlas reigned. And this Atlas king should not be confused with Atlas the Titan, because there are 2 characters named Atlas in Greek mythology. The most famous Atlas is probably the Titan, one brother of Prometheus, who was condemned by Zeus, the king of gods, to carry the sky or the universe on his shoulders. And we know this image of the Titan Atlas carrying the planet. But the Atlas we are talking about now was a son of Poseidon, the god of the seas, and he gave his name to Atlantis. It is also likely that one of these two Atlas gave his name to the mountain chain in North Africa, the Atlas Mountains that spread from Morocco to Tunisia. And one of them, too, we don't precisely know who, gave his name to the Atlantic Ocean as well. So the Atlantic Ocean and Atlantis, the mythical continent, share the same origin, and given the indications given by Plato, Atlantis has generally been located in the Atlantic Ocean. Plato also wrote that Atlantis would have existed long before his time, about 9,000 years before, which means more than 11 million years for us. That the kingdom of Atlantis had a elaborate and powerful civilization, that the inhabitants benefited from precious resources, and in particular a mysterious metal called orichalcum. For the Greeks, orichalcum meant copper from the mountain, or mountain copper. Oros in Greek means mountain, and chalcos is copper. And this mysterious metal, due to its properties and value, would have given the Atlants considerable power and wealth. And finally, he also indicated that the Atlants were colonizing, expanding eastward, that they had colonized the Mediterranean Sea, including Italy or even Egypt, and that only the city of Athens resisted their advance, but that at some point the kingdom of Atlantis was destroyed by a cataclysm. He does not really precise why or how, but this entire civilization would have disappeared overnight. When Plato wrote this in the antiquity, nobody believed that it could actually be true, and that it had to be taken literally, because it was fairly common in the dialogues of Plato for him to invent tales, metaphors, to defend his opinions, to express them. And in the following centuries, the dialogues of Plato were never lost. They continued to be studied by the Romans, and then with the rest of Greek philosophy, this knowledge was passed to the Muslim civilization from the 7th century, and also remained well known in European universities where this philosophy was transmitted. But actually, for about 15 centuries, the idea that Atlantis actually had existed did not appear, and it's only during the Middle Age in Europe that some people started to wonder whether this continent of Atlantis could have been a reality and not only a metaphor invented by Plato. This hypothesis that Atlantis could have been a reality probably gained popularity in the Renaissance period with the exploration of the world, and especially in the Atlantic Ocean, because new lands were discovered and European explorers started to realize that the world was much larger and much more diverse than they would have imagined during the Middle Age. And from this moment on, two positions, two visions appeared and continue to exist today. The first one considers that Atlantis was just a metaphor invented by Plato, and the main arguments that support this opinion, this vision, are that, as I said before, Plato often invented tales of that kind, that nobody before him ever mentioned Atlantis, that there were no traces of this mysterious continent, and so that the hypothesis of Atlantis as a reality was not very credible. And with the progress in archaeology, especially since the 18th and 19th centuries, it becomes fairly obvious that imagining an elaborate and complex civilization 11 millennia ago is something difficult. The most ancient civilizations we know, such as ancient Egypt or the civilizations in Mesopotamia, appeared about 3 to 4 millennia max before Christ, and Plato locates in history Atlantis 9 millennia before Christ. On the other hand, there has been proponents of the idea, the theory, that Atlantis was not just an invention, some of them thinking or believing that Atlantis had actually existed as such, and that Plato's writings could be taken literally. But this theory is generally considered very little credible by historians and archaeologists, because no proof ever appeared, and today this belief in the Atlantis described by Plato as a reality is limited to fans of the occult or believers in the alien origin of human civilization, and these circles are quite marginal. But among the proponents of Atlantis as a myth containing parts of reality, there are also historians or scholars believing that maybe, and with significant alterations, this myth of Atlantis, told by Plato, contains elements that actually existed, or is a transformed tale of true events. And in the 20th century, a parallel has been made between this story of the destruction of Atlantis and what happened in the second millennium before Christ, more than 1,000 years before Plato, to the civilization that flourished in Crete, south of the Aegean Sea, in the middle of the oriental half of the Mediterranean Sea, to the Minoan civilization. This civilization of Crete, which appeared and developed before the times of classical Greece, suffered a terrible disaster. There was a tsunami on the northern shores of Crete around the 17th century before Christ, and this tsunami, these earthquakes too, probably came from a volcanic eruption in another island north of Crete called Santorini, and research made in the 20th century helped bring credibility to this possibility that maybe the tale of Plato recycled actual events that had been obviously very impressive for people living in that period. However, in the 19th century, this myth of Atlantis was popularized by various writers, by adventurers, and even by esoterists. So Atlantis started to appear in popular novels. An example of that is the novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne, in which Atlantis is referenced as a lost continent under the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. And this was also a period when other myths about continents that would have disappeared emerged. For example, the myth of Mu, a mysterious continent that would have existed in the Pacific Ocean, and from which the pre-Columbians would have come. And this legend of Mu was popularized by an adventurer in the 19th century. So this is quite recent. Another example is a continent called Lemuria. Lemuria was initially a scientific theory about a continent that would have existed in the Indian Ocean, because scientists, biologists, and zoologists, more precisely, had observed that species that were very similar lived in Australia and in the eastern part of Africa, especially on the island of Madagascar. And among these species, the Lemurians, the animals that were very close to the populations observed in Australia, existed. And given the knowledge in this time, it seemed impossible to explain the presence of very similar animals on both sides of the Indian Ocean, so that the possibility of an ancient continent called Lemuria, because of the Lemurians, was proposed. The theory being that the Lemurians had been able to cross the Indian Ocean thanks to this continent before it disappeared under the sea. In the 20th century, this theory was clearly abandoned by scientists because the plate tectonics theory and the continental drift managed to explain in a much more credible way how Australia and Africa had been separated millions of years before. But this Lemuria continent continued to exist as a legend because it was quickly adopted, some would say hijacked, by esoterists who introduced it in their vision of the history of the world. So as you see, these myths of lost continents are not only about Atlantis, they are extremely seductive, and so are these tales of cities or entire continents that would have disappeared overnight, punished by God or by the gods, or just because despite their glory they remained exposed and extremely weak in front of the power of nature. And as I said in the video about the myth of Labyrinth, these myths are interesting also, and so popular, moving from one generation to another, and sometimes surviving several millennia, because they always tell us something about the human mind, about how we experience the world around us, or about human societies. In the case of this myth of Atlantis, there is probably a fascination for these tales, maybe as an expression of our fear of disappearing whatever we build individually or as a human society. There is this fear of being nothing in front of the forces of nature or divine forces, and there is probably also this appeal for romantic tales of entire civilizations that disappear much faster than they appeared, or this nostalgia in front of the passing of time. And there may be also a warning to men if they defy the forces of nature or try to elevate themselves above their condition. This might lead to a punishment, and this is probably what the myth of Atlantis conveys, and something that contributes to explain its enduring popularity. This is all for today. As usual, I hope you found this moment spent together interesting and relaxing. Don't forget to vote for one of the next topics I will talk about, and see you soon. Bye bye.